Imagine, um, if you will, a scenario where you fall into this deep, completely uninterrupted sleep on June 28, 2007.
Just a totally normal Tuesday.
Right, exactly. Just picture the world as it was on that specific day.
Mm-hmm.
You might have been carrying a Motorola Razr in your pocket.
Oh man, the flip phones. Or like maybe a
That's
bulky BlackBerry if you were feeling particularly corporate that day.
Yeah, the BlackBerry. And if you wanted to send a text message to a friend,
Mm-hmm.
you were relying on T9 predictive text.
Which was an absolute nightmare.
Literally hammering the number 7 key 4 separate times just to type the letter S.
Right, it was physical work.
It really was. And, the internet existed, of course, but it was a destination. It was this place you went to by sitting down at a heavy desk in your house, waiting for a machine to boot up, and, actively deciding to log on.
It was a conscious physical action. I mean, you visited the digital world, but you lived entirely in the physical one.
Which makes this thought experiment. Now, this is a concept we're borrowing from the author Tobias Rose-Stockwell in his book, Outrage Machine. It makes it so incredibly jarring. So you pull a modern-day Rip Van Winkle.
Right.
You close your eyes in that 2007 reality the exact day before the very first iPhone is released to the public.
The literal day before.
Yeah, and you wake up exactly 10 years later, you shake off the sleep, you step outside your front door, and you look around. At first glance, the architecture of the physical world looks largely identical. I mean, the oak tree in the front yard is still there.
The asphalt on the street is the same.
Right. The buildings haven't fundamentally changed. But then you start to observe the humans, and the way the human beings are behaving is profoundly, almost terrifyingly strange.
Yeah, if you had no context for what had happened over that decade, the scene would look like the opening act of, like a subtle psychological horror film.
Because nearly every single person you see is clutching this glowing rectangle made of glass and metal, and it completely dictates their physical posture.
Just bent over.
Exactly. Anytime they stop moving, the very second they sit down on a subway bench or step into a crowded elevator or just, pause to stand in line for a coffee, they immediately assume this hunched-over posture, necks bent, entirely captivated by the rectangle.
It's a total physical takeover.
And you walk into what used to be a bustling, noisy public space, like a doctor's waiting room or a community park, and there is this eerie, unnatural quiet.
Yeah, that's the part that really gets you.
Even the babies. Like the toddlers who, by every biological metric, should be babbling, throwing things, and clumsily crawling around, they're completely silent. They're strapped into strollers, completely mesmerized by glowing screens placed inches from their faces.
It's wild.
And when you finally do hear a grown adult speaking out loud, they aren't making eye contact with anyone. They appear to be talking into the void, wearing these little white earplugs.
It is a stark mental image. Because it forces us to recognize how entirely the adult world was rewired in the span of a single decade. But the core of the source material we are examining today suggests something much more alarming.
Right.
That while this technological shift was distracting and strange for fully formed adults, it was something entirely different and vastly more consequential for human beings who were still developing.
Yeah, the transition for teenagers was an absolute earthquake. I mean, back in that 2007 world you went to sleep in, adolescents were absolutely texting, but there were physical and logistical limits.
Wow.
You texted one person at a time, and usually the entire point of the text was just to figure out a physical time and a physical place to meet up.
Because nobody wanted to stare at a 2-inch plastic screen for 3 consecutive hours.
Exactly. But after this massive cultural shift, what the source text defines as the Great Rewiring, it became completely normalized for adolescents to spend the vast majority of their waking, non-school hours interacting with a smartphone. Suddenly, the phone wasn't a tool to facilitate physical meetup.
The phone was the destination itself.
Right. They were suddenly spending hours consuming content from total strangers, managing highly curated social media profiles, and navigating endless streams of auto-playing videos.
And this brings us to the fundamental premise of our discussion today. The data from the mid-2010s shows a sudden, dramatic plunge in the time adolescents spent socializing in person. We are looking at a historic transition from what the researchers call a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood.
And that's a massive distinction.
It is, and it is vital to establish right up front that this isn't just a simple nostalgic complaint about kids spending a little too much time indoors. We aren't just doing the modern equivalent of complaining that kids watch too much television. We are analyzing a fundamental structural disruption of biological, psychological, and cultural development.
Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to thoroughly unpack a massive stack of source material that explores exactly what happens to child and adolescent development when daily life is radically rewired by technology. We're going to look at the biology of how a human brain expects to grow and what happens when those expectations are completely derailed by algorithms. Okay, let's unpack this.
To truly grasp the severity of how technology disrupts childhood, we really have to pull the lens way back. We have to look past the screens and examine the biology of human development. Because if you look at human childhood through a purely evolutionary lens, it is an absolute anomaly.
I have to admit, reading the research on the human growth curve was a complete paradigm shift for me. Compared to the rest of the animal kingdom, the pacing of how a human being grows is incredibly bizarre. It goes like incredibly fast, then incredibly slow for almost a decade, and then incredibly fast again.
It defies the standard logic of the animal kingdom. Take chimpanzees, our closest evolutionary relatives. If you plot a chimp's physical growth on a graph, it forms a very steady, highly efficient upward slope.
Just a straight diagonal line.
Yeah, exactly. They grow at a remarkably consistent pace from birth until they reach sexual maturity, at which point they begin reproducing. And from a strictly biological survival of the fittest standpoint, that chimp model makes perfect sense.
Because the whole point is just to reproduce.
Right. The overarching goal of evolution is to maximize surviving offspring. The faster an organism can grow up, become strong enough to defend itself, and reach the reproduction phase, the more successful it is.
So why on earth do human children hit the brakes? I mean, we grow rapidly for the first couple of years of life, getting out of that helpless infant stage. But then, right around age 2, physical growth just plateaus.
It just flatlines.
Yeah, it slows down to an absolute crawl for the next 7 to 10 years. It isn't until puberty hits that we undergo this explosive, rapid growth spurt before finally reaching adult size. But here's the paradox that really highlights the strangeness of this. The text points out that human child's brain is already 90% of its full adult physical size by the age of 5.
90%.
The hardware is virtually completely built. So why is there a decade-long delay before the physical body catches up? Especially considering our evolutionary history. I mean, early Homo sapiens children were big-brained, small-bodied, relatively slow-moving weaklings. They were running around dangerous environments, practically serving themselves up to predators on a silver platter.
What's fascinating here is how the source material answers that exact question. The evolutionary trade-off is entirely centered around the concept of culture. Somewhere between 1 million and 3 million years ago, as our genus, Homo, emerged from earlier hominid ancestors, we fundamentally changed the rules of survival. We became cultural creatures.
And that shifted everything.
Completely. And the development of culture profoundly physically altered our evolutionary trajectory. A brilliant example provided in the text is the mastery of fire for cooking food.
Let's pause and visualize that because the mechanics of this are just mind-blowing to me. The invention of the campfire wasn't just like a lifestyle upgrade. It changed our DNA.
It absolutely did, through a process known as gene-culture coevolution. Essentially, the cultural practices we invent can alter our physical environment so drastically that our bodies have to adapt genetically over generations.
Wow.
Yeah, think about raw food. Raw food takes a massive amount of energy, time, and heavy jaw musculature to chew and digest. When our ancestors began cooking food, they were essentially pre-digesting it outside the body.
Because the heat breaks it down.
Exactly. Cooked food is vastly softer and exponentially richer in easily accessible calories. So over generations, the humans who had slightly smaller jaws and slightly shorter digestive tracts survived just fine because of this cultural invention.
That makes total sense.
But more importantly, the massive amount of biological energy that was previously required to run a massive digestive system was suddenly freed up. And evolution reallocated that surplus energy to the most metabolically expensive organ in the body.
The brain. So because we learned to cook, our guts shrank and our brains exploded in size. And that sudden increase in brain power entirely shifted what it took to survive. Survival was no longer an arm wrestling match, It wasn't about who had the sharpest claws or who could sprint the fastest. The evolutionary race was suddenly won by the individuals who were the most adept at learning.
The defining trait of our species became the ability to tap into a massive, invisible pool of accumulated knowledge. You didn't have to invent a hunting technique from scratch. You just had to learn it from the elders in your community.
Yeah.
You had to master language, tool making, social navigation, and seasonal migration patterns.
Which chimps just don't have.
Right, chimpanzees do not have this vast transgenerational cultural library. But for humans, the sheer volume of information required to survive became so immense that a rapid, chimp-like childhood was no longer viable. Evolution realized that if a human grew up too fast, they wouldn't have enough time to learn the survival skills of their community. So a biological speed limit was installed.
A literal speed limit on growing.
Exactly. Evolution intentionally delayed our physical maturation to force us into a decade-long period of cultural apprenticeship.
Think of it like this. Imagine the human brain is a highly advanced piece of smartphone hardware that rolls off the assembly line fully built by age 5. The physical casing, the massive screen, the battery, it's 90% complete.
Yeah.
You hold it, and it looks like a finished product.
But there's no software yet.
Right. If you try to use it to navigate the complexities of society, it's essentially a brick. It takes another 10 entire years of leaving that phone constantly plugged into the local network to slowly download, configure, and install the incredibly complex, nuanced operating system of human culture.
That analogy captures the unseen labor of childhood perfectly. During that long 10-year plateau of physical growth, the brain isn't getting much larger in mass, but structurally, it is undergoing a frantic, massive rewiring process. It is constantly pruning and myelinating.
Pruning and myelinating.
Yes. Picture the young brain as a dense, overgrown forest of neural pathways. As a child experiences the physical world, interacting with peers and environments, the neural pathways that are used infrequently begin to wither and fade away. This is the pruning.
So it's clearing out the clutter.
Precisely. Meanwhile, the specific pathways that are fired constantly, the local language, the local social customs, the specific physical skills needed in their environment, those are reinforced. They are coated in a fatty substance called myelin, which acts like insulation on an electrical wire, allowing the signals to travel exponentially faster. This decade-long rewiring is the cultural apprenticeship.
But that raises a massive logistical problem for evolution. If human biology is banking on this 10-year delay to install the cultural operating system, how does nature guarantee that the child will actually do the work?
Right, they aren't going to do it willingly.
No. You can't sit a hyperactive 7-year-old down and explain, listen, you need to spend the next 5 years practicing complex social negotiations and physical risk assessment so you don't fail at life when you're 20. The kid doesn't care.
Not at all.
So nature had to pre-install specific irresistible motivations. The text outlines 3 powerful evolutionary drives that guarantee this learning happens: the drive for free play, the drive for attunement, and the drive for social learning.
And that first drive, the drive for free play, is perhaps the most universally recognized yet misunderstood aspect of childhood. Play is not a break from learning. Play is the literal work of childhood.
The work.
Yes, it is the primary mechanism through which that dense neural forest is pruned and organized. And this is not a uniquely human trait. All young mammals share this exact evolutionary mandate. The source material references hundreds of controlled studies on young rats, monkeys, and humans, all pointing to the same undeniable conclusion. Young mammals possess a profound innate drive to play vigorously.
And what happens if they don't?
Well, if you artificially deprive a young mammal of the ability to play, the results are devastating. They emerge into adulthood socially incompetent, highly anxious, and cognitively impaired.
Wow. The breakdown of how this works in other animals really clarified it for me. The text uses the classic example of a kitten. If you drag a piece of yarn across the floor, a kitten will instantly crouch down, dilate its pupils, and clumsily pounce on it. Now, the kitten isn't doing this because it consciously knows it needs to practice hunting.
Right, it's not thinking about the future.
No, it doesn't, because the movement of the yarn triggers highly specialized ancient circuits in its visual cortex. It feels incredibly fun and urgent to the kitten. But biologically, through the repetitive, playful act of pouncing, missing, adjusting its balance, and pouncing again, that kitten is physically myelinating the neural pathways that will eventually make it a skilled, lethal mouse hunter. Play is nature's disguised training program.
Human children follow a remarkably similar progression, though it scales up to meet the demands of a vastly more complex society. Human toddlers start with basic physical mastery. They run around aimlessly, they climb up onto the back of the sofa, they jump off the bottom step.
Just testing boundaries.
Exactly. They are learning the physics of their own bodies in gravity. Once the brain masters that, the play evolves. They graduate to what developmental researchers call multiplayer predator-prey games.
Like tag.
Yes, this is where you see the emergence of tag, hide and seek, or sharks and minnows. They are practicing the adrenaline rush of pursuit and evasion within a safe container.
And as they enter late childhood, the play becomes incredibly psychological. The physical running around starts to take a back seat to verbal play. Teasing, joking, negotiating the rules of a game, and even gossiping. And while adults often look at kids arguing over the rules of a game as a nuisance, the text argues this is an advanced masterclass in social navigation.
It absolutely is.
Like when kids are teasing each other, they're constantly reading microexpressions. If you tease a friend and you accidentally push it a little too far, you immediately see their face drop. You feel the tension, and you have to figure out how to deploy instantaneous relationship repair to keep the game going.
That real-time, unvarnished feedback is the crucial ingredient. Developmental psychologist Peter Gray, whose work is heavily cited in our sources, explicitly defines free play. And the definition is vital because it separates true play from adult-directed activities. Gray states that free play must be freely chosen by the participants, directed entirely by the kids themselves, and undertaken strictly for its own sake.
So no adult coaches.
None. It is not an activity designed to achieve an external goal or build a resume. True free play requires the participants to actively suppress the drive to dominate.
Wait, really? Suppress dominance?
Yes, because if one child just bullies everyone else, the playgroup fractures and the game ends. Therefore, to keep the fun going, children are highly motivated to compromise, cooperate, and ensure everyone is engaged. They are organically building the cooperative bonds necessary to survive in a democratic society.
That makes a lot of sense. The text also stresses that free play absolutely requires risk and low stakes. That sounds like an oxymoron, risk and low stakes, but it makes total sense. Kids need physical risk to learn the boundaries of safety. If two kids are trying to figure out how to balance on a seesaw, or they're having a pretend sword fight with sticks in the woods, there's a risk of a bruised shin or scraped knee.
Right.
But the stakes are not lethal. If the seesaw negotiation fails, someone falls in the wood chips. They experience a brief flash of physical pain and maybe some mild social embarrassment. They dust themselves off, they recalibrate their approach, and they try again.
The absence of adults in these scenarios cannot be overstated. When a well-meaning parent, teacher, or coach steps in to referee a dispute or ensure nobody gets a scraped knee, the activity instantly ceases to be free play.
Because the adults take over the risk management.
Exactly. Adults naturally dictate the rules and sanitize the risk, but children need to experience the friction of trial and error. The source brings in a brilliant insight from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, to illustrate why this friction is so necessary. The core principle here is that the emotional brain is not developed through the intake of information. It is developed through raw experience.
That is such a vital distinction. I mean, you could sit an 8-year-old down in a perfectly quiet classroom and give them a beautifully illustrated worksheet on how to manage frustration when your friend cheats at a game. And the kid might be able to parrot the information back to you.
But it doesn't change their brain.
No.
No.
That information does absolutely nothing to rewire the emotional processing centers of the brain. The only way to build that neural circuitry is for the kid to actually be out in the backyard, get cheated, feel a hot flush of anger in their chest, yell about it, negotiate a new rule, and calm down enough to keep playing.
Which brings us face to face with the catastrophic disruption of the phone-based childhood. The source material categorizes smartphones and tablets as experience blockers. The incredibly potent, addictive design of these digital platforms simply devours the finite hours available in a day, the time that, for a million years, was dedicated to physically bumping into the world and other children, is now spent entirely stationary.
Now, I want to play devil's advocate here because this is where the modern reality collides with the theory. A listener right now might be thinking, wait a minute, when my kid puts on a headset and logs into a massive multiplayer video game like Fortnite or Roblox with 3 of their school friends, isn't that just the modern equivalent of playing in the woods? They are strategizing, they are exploring a space, they are talking to each other. Why does the physical bruised knee aspect matter so much?
It's a common defense, but it fundamentally misunderstands the biological expectations of the developing brain. The human nervous system evolved over millions of years expecting embodied synchronous interactions. It expects the friction of physical stakes. In the physical world, if a child acts out or breaks the rules of the game, they have to face the immediate, readable facial feedback of a peer standing 2 feet away. They feel the awkward silence. They have to actively engage in relationship repair because they are physically stuck in the same backyard.
You can't just evaporate.
Right. Social media and internet-based gaming environments operate under the exact opposite conditions. They are largely disembodied. But crucially, virtual rooms are incredibly easy to join and entirely frictionless to leave. If a conflict arises in a virtual space, or if the interaction gets slightly uncomfortable, a child doesn't have to practice the incredibly difficult skill of resolving the conflict. They can simply log off.
Just hit the exit button.
Yeah, they can mute the person, block them, or switch servers. The technology provides an escape hatch that prevents the emotional brain from ever having to do the heavy lifting of navigating discomfort.
Furthermore, the way adolescents actually use social media platforms is the antithesis of Peter Gray's definition of play. Remember, true play is done strictly for its own sake. It's spontaneous. But existing on a platform like Instagram, Snapchat, or TikTok forces young people to operate like professional brand managers.
Brand managers, that's exactly what it is.
There's nothing spontaneous about it. They are meticulously calculating the social consequences of every single photo they post, every comment they leave, and even the specific tone of the emojis they select. Every public action is deeply strategic. It is consciously pursued to achieve an external goal, acquiring likes, avoiding public shaming, and managing their quantified social status.
And while playground mistakes are low stakes and quickly forgotten, digital mistakes are permanent and highly visible.
Because everything is recorded.
Exactly. A misunderstanding on the playground vanishes into the air. A poorly phrased comment online can be screenshotted, shared among hundreds of peers instantly, and referenced for years. The environment is devoid of the low-stakes safety required for true emotional learning.
The data presented in the text perfectly illustrates the magnitude of this shift. There is a staggering chart that tracks the percentage of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the United States who report getting together with their friends almost every day. If you look at the 1990s and the early 2000s, you see a very slow, gradual decline.
Barely noticeable.
Right. But then, right around the early 2010s, which precisely mirrors the moment when the adolescent population transitioned from basic flip phones to internet-connected smartphones, that slow decline turns into an absolute cliff. The line falls straight down. The author notes that this accelerating decline in physical, face-to-face meetups isn't just a side effect of the Great Rewiring, it is the Great Rewiring. An entire generation simultaneously packed up their childhoods, abandoned the physical world, and relocated into a virtual space.
And when that mass migration occurred, the children didn't just lose the benefits of free play. They lost the environment required to satisfy the second major evolutionary drive, attunement.
Let's talk about attunement. This concept is incredibly beautiful to read about, but when you realize how profoundly it's being interrupted, it is genuinely heartbreaking. Attunement is the hardwired human need to tune and synchronize our physical movements and our emotional states with the people around us.
It is the absolute foundation of human connection, and it begins in the very first weeks of an infant's life. At that stage, infants have very little muscular control, but they can manage a few basic facial expressions. Because human babies are so utterly helpless, nature designed them to elicit caretaking behavior.
It's survival.
Completely. When a parent looks at a baby, the parent is biologically compelled to engage in long rounds of mutual gazing and face-making. The parent widens their eyes, makes a soft sound, and waits. The baby registers the face, feels a sense of safety, and mimics the expression or smiles. The parent feels a rush of joy and makes another face. It creates a seamless, mutually reinforcing feedback loop of physical attachment.
But the smartphone is violently severing even this most basic, ancient interaction. The source material cites a sobering Pew Research study which found that 17% of American parents report they're often distracted by their phones when spending time with their children. And another 52% admit they are sometimes distracted.
That's a huge majority.
It's massive. So picture that biological feedback loop. You have an infant instinctually seeking that mutual gaze, trying to lock onto the parent's eyes to feel secure, and the parent is looking down at a glowing screen mentally miles away, responding to an email or scrolling a feed. The biological bond is experiencing constant micro-interruptions.
As that infant grows into a toddler, that basic mutual gazing evolves into what developmental psychologists refer to as serve and return interactions. It operates very much like a slow-motion game of tennis.
Serve return.
Yeah. The toddler will babble or point at something that's the serve. They then look at the parent and wait to see the reaction, the return. They are learning the intricate rhythms of human conversation. They are learning how to read microexpressions to know exactly how long a pause should last before they make their next sound. According to the National Institute for Play, this physical attunement isn't just cute behavior. It forms the absolute neural foundation for emotional self-regulation later in life.
And when kids reach school age, this serve and return instinct scales up into a pursuit of perfect, high-speed synchrony with their peers. The text brings up these incredibly nostalgic examples like girls jumping double dutch together or playing high-speed hand-clapping games like pat a cake.
Right, pat a cake.
Think about the mechanics of pat a cake. Two kids are matching their hand motions flawlessly, anticipating the other's movements, while simultaneously singing a rhythmic, high-speed nonsense song. The fascinating part is that there is no way to win pat a cake. The goal isn't victory. The entire purpose, the massive rush of pleasure they get from it, comes entirely from the ancient magic of physical synchrony. They are generating a feeling of communion.
And that feeling of communion scales up to the level of entire societies. Anthropologists have long noted that collective rituals involving synchronous movement, whether it is a tribe drumming around a fire, a congregation chanting in a cathedral, or a crowd dancing to a heady bass line, are universally human.
Everyone does it.
The pioneering sociologist Emil Durkheim actually coined a term for this phenomenon. He called it social electricity. When human beings move their bodies in perfect time with one another, it generates a profound, almost intoxicating sense of belonging. It bypasses the logical brain entirely. And to prove just how deeply hardwired this is, the source text highlights a brilliant piece of research known as the beer mug study.
Oh, the beer mug study. If there is one specific image from this deep dive that is going to stick in my head, it is this one. Let me break down how they set this up, because the methodology is so clever.
It really is.
Researchers brought small groups of college students into a room. Every student was given a set of headphones and a heavy beer mug. The instructions were incredibly simple. Put on the headphones, hold the mug out in front of you, and just sway your body back and forth to the rhythm of the music playing in your ears.
Sounds easy enough.
Right, but here is the trick. For half of these groups, the researchers piped the exact same song into every set of headphones at the exact same millisecond.
Oh.
So naturally, without even trying, these students ended up swaying their mugs in perfect synchronized harmony with the people next to them.
Okay.
But for the other half of the groups, the researchers deliberately staggered the music. Every headphone was playing a different beat. So the students in these groups were swaying entirely out of sync, totally disjointed from the people standing right next to them.
It seems like a silly parlor trick, but the second phase of the experiment reveals something profound about human nature. After the swaying exercise, the headphones were removed, and the groups were instructed to play a classic economic trust game. The rules of the game are designed to test selfishness versus cooperation.
The ultimate test.
Yeah. In this game, the group as a whole makes the highest financial payout if every single person chooses to cooperate round after round. However, any individual student can sneakily earn a little extra cash for themselves if they make a selfish choice and betray the group.
So what happened?
The researchers analyzed the data and found a staggering difference. The groups who had simply swayed in physical synchrony with one another trusted each other significantly more. They cooperated far more frequently, they betrayed each other less, and ultimately the group made more money than the groups who swayed out of sync.
Just from swaying together, that is the part that blows my mind. They didn't have a deep conversation about their childhoods. They didn't sign a contract. The mere physical act of synchronous movement bypassed all their logical defenses and flipped an ancient switch in their brains that said, these people are moving to my rhythm. They are my tribe. I can trust them. Synchronous, face-to-face, physical interaction is essentially a biological cheat code for building trust.
And yet, look at the reality of the phone-based childhood. What do the major tech platforms offer adolescents? Endless hours of asynchronous, totally disembodied interaction.
It's the exact opposite of the beer mugs.
The contrast could not be more severe. The source text points to data from 2014 showing that nearly a third of teenage girls were spending over 20 hours a week on social media platforms.
Over 20 hours.
20 hours. That is the equivalent of a part-time job. And it operates like a job. They're performing the labor of creating, editing, and curating their own content, while simultaneously performing the labor of endlessly scrolling and reacting to the content of others. And crucially, researchers note that this labor is frequently devoid of joy.
So they aren't even having fun.
No, they aren't scrolling for 20 hours a week because it feels fantastic. They are doing it out of a sheer, paralyzing terror of missing out or being socially ostracized. It morphs from a tool into a mindless, compulsive habit.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. I was trying to come up with an analogy to capture the emotional difference between these two states.
Mhm.
Attunement, that real-world pat-a-cake synchrony we just explored, is like playing in a live jazz band in a cramped, sweaty little club. You are improvising together in real time. You physically feel the rhythm vibrating in the floorboards. You watch the bassist's eyes to know exactly when the tempo change is coming. You hear the drummer taking a breath. It is alive, and it is immediate.
It's visceral.
Exactly. Social media, on the other hand, is like recording your trumpet solo entirely alone in a dark closet. You finish, you email the audio file to the rest of the band, and then you sit there in the dark, refreshing your inbox for 3 hours, waiting to see if they reply with a thumbs-up emoji.
Mm.
The song might technically get pieced together in the end, but the soul, the social electricity, the actual connection, is completely dead.
That is a highly effective way to visualize it, precisely because it highlights the complete absence of the physical body. For millions of years, humans evolved to utilize our hands, our microexpressions, the dilation of our pupils, and the slight tilt of our heads as vital, high-speed communication channels. We are designed to respond in real time to the muscular movements of the people we're talking to.
But online, there are no muscles.
Right. In the virtual world, the body is entirely irrelevant. The only muscles engaged are the thumbs swiping against cold glass. The text notes with a bit of dark irony that an entire generation is learning how to carefully select digital emojis from a menu rather than actually using their own facial muscles to express emotion. When you consider this massive redirection of energy away from physical synchrony and into asynchronous, disembodied platforms, it suddenly makes perfect sense why so many teenagers reported feeling profoundly lonely and starved for genuine connections starting in the early 2010s.
So if kids are no longer attuning to their parents because the parents are distracted, and they are no longer experiencing synchronous physical play with their peers, a massive vacuum opens up. They still have the biological mandate to download the cultural operating system, but their primary real-world teachers are missing. So who fills that void? Who are they looking to for guidance on how to behave? Which brings us to the third and final evolutionary drive: social learning.
Because humans survived by becoming cultural creatures, evolution heavily rewarded the individuals who were the best learners. But being a good learner in the Pleistocene epoch didn't mean sitting quietly at a desk and getting an A in algebra. It meant activating an intense, innate desire to scan your environment, identify the most successful people, and copy their behaviors.
Now, instinctually, you might assume that a child should just look at their parents and copy whatever they do. But the text highlights that from a pure survival standpoint, that is a terrible, highly risky strategy.
It really is.
Biologically speaking, there is absolutely no reason for a child to assume that their specific genetic parents happen to be the most highly skilled, competent adults in the entire tribe. If your father is a remarkably terrible hunter and you rely entirely on copying him, you are going to starve. Furthermore, a child needs to learn how to survive as a child among other children, which is a completely different skill set than being an adult. So, children are hardwired to look outward, beyond the family unit.
To understand how they choose who to copy, the text introduces the work of researchers Rod Boyd and Pete Richardson, who are leading scholars in the field of gene-culture coevolution. They identified several distinct learning strategies that became permanently hardwired into the human brain over thousands of generations. For our deep dive today, we need to focus on two paramount strategies: conformist bias and prestige bias.
Conformist bias is the biological equivalent of the phrase, "when in Rome, do as the Romans do." It is the deeply ingrained instinct to figure out what the majority of people around you are doing and immediately mimic it.
Safety in numbers.
Right. Evolutionarily, going along with the crowd is generally the safest bet. If you are a kid starting your first day at a brand new middle school, you feel this intense, almost gravitational pull in your stomach to figure out what the dominant trends are. What kind of shoes is everyone wearing? What slang are they using? We colloquially refer to this as peer pressure, but the researchers suggest a more accurate term is conformity attraction. You aren't being pushed, you're being magnetically pulled toward the norm.
The danger arises when we change the environment in which this biological instinct operates. In a real-world physical setting, accurately mapping the social norm takes a significant amount of time. If a child moves to a new town, they have to spend weeks slowly observing multiple different groups in the cafeteria, watching interactions on the playground, and listening to conversations in the hallway to build a reliable mental map of what behavior is acceptable. It's a slow process.
Very slow. But on a social media platform, a child can scroll through 1,000 discrete data points in a single hour. At a rate of 3 seconds per video or post, they are drinking from a fire hose of cultural norms. And unlike the ambiguous real world, every single piece of content online is accompanied by hard, undeniable numerical evidence. The like counts, the view metrics, the comment ratios.
The engagement.
Yes, these metrics instantaneously tell the child's brain whether that specific behavior was a resounding social success or a humiliating failure.
It is a terrifyingly efficient learning machine. The text explicitly refers to social media platforms as the most efficient conformity engines ever invented. They have the power to entirely shape an adolescent's mental model of what is acceptable in a matter of hours.
Hours instead of weeks. If you pause and think about that from a parenting perspective, it is incredibly daunting. Parents will struggle for 3 years just trying to get a child to consistently say please or sit up straight at the dinner table, because parents inherently do not wield the power of conformist bias. So when a single parent is trying to teach values and they are competing against the socializing power of a platform that delivers 1,000 hyper-targeted, numerically peer-reviewed examples of behavior an hour, the parent is entirely outmatched. The math just doesn't work.
It is a vastly unequal battle. But the situation becomes even more precarious when we introduce the second evolutionary strategy, prestige bias. This concept was studied extensively by the evolutionary anthropologist Joe Henrich. Henrich drew a critical distinction between how humans organize their social hierarchies compared to other primates.
Like the chimps again.
Right. In a troop of chimpanzees, status is entirely based on dominance. It is rooted in fear, aggression, and the constant threat of physical violence. The biggest, most brutal chimp sits at the top of the hierarchy. But humans, because of our reliance on culture and learning, developed an alternative parallel ranking system based on prestige.
Prestige, not dominance.
Correct. Prestige is not taken by force. It is willingly conferred by the community upon individuals who demonstrate true excellence in a highly valued, necessary domain.
The text uses the example of Frank the Archer to explain this. Imagine you live in a small hunter-gatherer community, and survival heavily depends on archery. Through years of observation, the entire community comes to an unspoken consensus that Frank is, without a doubt, the absolute best archer in the tribe.
Everyone just knows it.
Exactly. Even if you, as a young child, have never personally seen Frank shoot a bow, you absorb the community's reverence for him. You trust the collective assessment. Henrich points out that humans possess a unique instinct to become starstruck and deferential to prestigious people. We don't fear them like a dominant chimp. We revere them.
We want to be near them.
We feel a deep motivation to get close to them, to mimic their mannerisms, and to learn from them, with the subconscious goal of eventually raising our own skills and prestige by association.
And this specific biological vulnerability is where the architectural design of modern technology becomes truly insidious. The platform designers in Silicon Valley didn't just accidentally stumble into this dynamic. They explicitly targeted and exploited the prestige bias. They found a way to quantify prestige.
Turn it into math.
Yes, they took the subtle, organic, community-conferred status of excellence and flattened it into hard, inescapable numbers: likes, shares, retweets, and follower counts.
The source material includes a highly revealing quote from Sean Parker, the former president of Facebook. Reflecting on the early days of building the platform, he openly admitted that their primary objective was to figure out how to consume as much of human attention as possible.
Just hoarding attention.
Yeah. He described the invention of the like button as creating a social validation feedback loop. He explicitly noted that it was exactly the kind of psychological trick a hacker would invent, because it was, in his exact words, exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
They successfully hacked the human prestige system. By writing algorithms that quantify prestige based purely on the engagement and clicks of strangers, they completely severed the ancient, vital link between actual real-world excellence and social status.
And that decoupling has profound consequences for the developing brain. On social media, young people are no longer deploying their prestige bias to follow the best archer, the most compassionate nurse, or the wisest storyteller in their local community. They're aiming their incredibly powerful learning systems at influencers who became famous solely for what they do inside the virtual world.
Famous for being famous online.
And because the biological drive to copy the prestigious is so overwhelming, these adolescents are absorbing and mimicking ways of talking, behaving, and emoting that are entirely performative. They are copying behaviors optimized for algorithmic virality, which are often wildly inappropriate, highly combative, or even self-destructive if actually applied to a real-world office environment or a family dinner table.
Which is incredibly dangerous when you think about it.
Okay, I have to challenge this premise because I can clearly hear the skeptics listening right now. A critic might look at this and say, look, teenagers have literally always been obsessed with fitting in, and they have always worshipped celebrities. This isn't new.
It's the classic pushback.
Right. Didn't teenagers in the 1950s completely lose their minds and scream until they fainted over Elvis Presley? Didn't the youth of the 80s and 90s plaster every square inch of their bedroom walls with posters of boy bands and teen idols? Is this current dynamic genuinely unprecedented, or is it just the digital version of hanging an Elvis poster in your room?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of media history, the text acknowledges that the decoupling of excellence and prestige didn't start with the iPhone. It began in the 20th century with the rise of mass media. The cultural phenomenon of being famous for being famous germinated in the 1960s, evolved significantly through reality TV stars like Paris Hilton in the early 2000s, and was ultimately perfected for the internet age by figures like Kim Kardashian.
So the foundation was there.
It was. However, the difference between the 1950s and today lies in the volume, the velocity, and the bidirectional feedback loop of the technology. An Elvis poster hanging on a bedroom wall is entirely static.
It's just a piece of paper.
Exactly. It does not look back at the teenager. It does not monitor the teenager's eye movements, calculate how long they stare at it, and then instantly serve them thousands of slightly more extreme variations of Elvis to keep them engaged. Furthermore, staring at an Elvis poster does not give the teenager algorithmic, quantifiable feedback every 3 seconds on their own personal social value based on how closely they manage to mimic Elvis's hairstyle.
That is a massive distinction. The Elvis poster is a one-way street. The smartphone is a constantly calibrating feedback loop, telling the kid exactly what they need to do to gain status.
Exactly the point. Today, millions of Gen Z adolescents are utilizing their evolutionarily designed learning systems originally built to help them survive in the physical world, to study influencers whose sole domain of excellence is simply the meta skill of amassing followers. The only metric of success the algorithm recognizes is engagement.
It doesn't care if it's good or bad.
Right. It doesn't care if the content generating that engagement is educational, purely vapid, or actively toxic. The sheer scale, the continuous presence in the child's pocket, and the extreme intimacy of this influence are what make the current environment entirely unprecedented in human history.
So we've clearly established that this algorithmic hacking of human behavior is deeply concerning. But it begs a very specific question. Why is this specifically catastrophic for young people? An adult using Instagram is exposed to the exact same algorithms, the exact same quantified prestige. Why does this environment damage a 13-year-old so much more profoundly than it damages a 35-year-old?
That brings us to the final piece of the biological puzzle, the biological clock of the human brain. We need to talk about the concept of expectant brains and sensitive periods.
Sensitive periods.
Yes. This is where all the evolutionary biology we discussed at the very beginning comes full circle. We established that the brain waits 10 years to wire itself. But how does it know when to start? Brain development in mammals and birds is driven by a mechanism scientists call experience-expectant development. This means that specific, highly specialized parts of the brain become incredibly malleable, but only during specific, rigidly time-limited windows of life.
It literally expects something to happen.
Exactly. The brain literally expects to be bombarded with certain types of environmental experiences during those exact windows in order to wire its circuitry correctly.
And the text makes a very careful distinction between critical periods and sensitive periods.
Yeah.
Critical periods are harsh. They are absolute biological deadlines. If the experience doesn't happen before the window slams shut, the brain will never develop the capability.
It's a hard stop.
Yeah. The most famous example of a critical period, and there's an amazing famous photograph of this mentioned in the source material, involves an ethologist named Konrad Lorenz. Now, an ethologist is simply a scientist who studies animal behavior in their natural environments. Lorenz was studying baby geese, and he figured out that geese possess an evolved learning mechanism called imprinting.
Right, imprinting.
A few hours after a gosling hatches from its egg, a critical window opens in its brain. During this brief window, the gosling will visually imprint on and obsessively follow whatever mother-sized object happens to be moving through its field of vision. So, Lorenz manipulated the environment. He made sure that he was the only large object walking past the nest right after they hatched.
And it worked.
It worked perfectly. The famous photograph shows Lorenz walking across a grassy field, and trailing faithfully right behind his heavy boots is a perfect single-file line of baby goslings. They imprint it on his boots. And the terrifying part of that is that image, that attachment to the boots, is permanently stamped into the physical neural circuitry of those birds. The window opened, the boots walked by, the window slammed shut, the wiring was done.
Human brains are vastly more complex, so we have fewer of those rigid, hard-stop critical periods. Instead, we have what researchers call sensitive periods. A sensitive period is a developmental window where it is exceptionally easy, almost effortless, to acquire a specific skill. The brain is primed for it.
Like a sponge.
Yes. Once the sensitive window closes, it isn't impossible to learn the skill, but it becomes vastly more difficult, requiring immense conscious effort. Language acquisition is the clearest, most universally understood example of a sensitive period. If a child is exposed to multiple languages during their early sensitive period, they can absorb them effortlessly, developing a perfect native pronunciation in all of them.
Which is why kids pick it up so fast.
Exactly. The text points out that if a family moves to a foreign country and the child is 12 years old or younger, their language window is still open. They will absorb the new language and likely lose their original accent entirely. But if the child is 14 or older when they move, that specific sensitive period is already closing.
They missed the window.
They can still learn the vocabulary and the grammar, but they will almost certainly carry the accent of their native language for the rest of their lives. The neural concrete has started to set.
And here is the kicker, the piece of research that ties this entire deep dive together. Just as there is a sensitive period for language, there is a distinct sensitive period for cultural learning, a specific window where the brain figures out its identity, its relationship to the broader society, and how to process complex social emotions.
It's the cultural operating system being installed.
Right. The text highlights a fascinating, pivotal study conducted by the Japanese anthropologist Yasuko Minora. She wanted to figure out exactly when this cultural imprinting happens, so she studied a specific group of children, the kids of Japanese businessmen who had been temporarily transferred by their companies to live in California during the 1970s.
Very specific demographic.
Minora wanted to know at what exact age does living in the American culture permanently shape a child's internal psychological sense of self, even after they move back home to Japan.
Her findings were incredibly precise. She identified a very specific biological window between the ages of 9 and 15. She discovered that the children who spent a few years living in California during that exact age bracket came to permanently internally feel American.
They absorbed the culture.
They absorbed the cultural operating system of the United States. Consequently, when their father's jobs transferred them back to Japan at age 15 or later, these teenagers had a terrible time readjusting. They felt like outsiders in their own country because their core cultural identity had already been locked in during their time in California.
Because the concrete had set.
Right. Conversely, the kids who didn't arrive in America until they were 15 or 16 never really felt American. Their sensitive period had passed. And the kids who lived in California but moved back to Japan well before they turned 14 easily readjusted to Japanese culture because their cultural window was still wide open and able to absorb the Japanese norms.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the gravity of this because the implications are massive. It is essentially like pouring wet concrete. During those specific years, from age 9 to age 15, the concrete of a child's cultural and social identity is wet. It is highly receptive. Whatever steps in it during those 6 years leaves a deep, permanent impression. But once they hit late adolescence, the window closes and the concrete hardens.
That is exactly what the biology dictates. Now take that biological reality and apply it to the timeline of the phone-based childhood. In a traditional play-based childhood, a child's wet concrete phase was shaped by a sequential, age-appropriate series of physical experiences. It was mediated by the adults in their local community and shared in physical space with same-age peers. It was a slow, localized imprinting.
Which is what the brain expected.
Exactly. But look at the modern paradigm. The average American child today is handed their first fully internet-connected smartphone right around age 11.
Right in the middle of the window.
Right smack in the middle of the wet concrete phase. They are instantaneously, with zero physical boundaries, plunged into a chaotic, algorithmically driven whirlpool.
Everything that gets rewarded or punished in that online space, the superficial depth of the parasocial relationships they form, their skewed understanding of what physical beauty looks like, their perception of what behaviors are desirable or shameful. All of it is being rapidly determined by the thousands of curated posts they scroll through every single week during the most biologically vulnerable window of their entire lives. We are quite literally letting engagement-maximizing algorithms walk all over the wet concrete of their developing brains.
Which brings total clarity to the alarming data we see regarding the mental health crisis. The source text points heavily to a major study out of the UK, led by the psychologist Amy Orban. She didn't just look at broad trends. She analyzed massive, granular data sets to pinpoint exactly when the use of social media correlated most strongly with a measurable decrease in life satisfaction and mental health.
And what were the ages?
Her findings perfectly map onto the biological sensitive periods we just discussed. She found a clear, undeniable spike in negative mental health outcomes precisely during the peak years of puberty. For girls, who generally enter puberty earlier than boys, the window of maximum harm from social media use was concentrated between the ages of 11 and 13.
Wow. And the boys?
For boys whose development trails slightly behind, the worst years were 14 and 15.
That is the exact same window. The 9 to 15 wet concrete phase identified by the anthropologist in the 1970s perfectly aligns with the window of maximum psychological harm caused by social media in the 2010s.
It is the exact same biological mechanism at work. This synthesis of data explains why every major chart tracking adolescent anxiety, clinical depression, self-harm, and general psychological fragility all show these sharp, sudden elbows, the lines suddenly bending straight upwards, right around the years 2010 to 2015. Generation Z, those born in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was the very first generation in human history to go through puberty and their sensitive cultural learning period while heavily utilizing smartphones.
The conclusion drawn by the source text regarding this timing is stark and, frankly, an indictment of current policy. Currently, the minimum legal age to open a social media account is 13. And we all know, practically speaking, that rule is completely unenforced. Kids just lie about their birth year.
Everyone knows they do.
Right. But the text argues that even if the age limit of 13 were strictly, flawlessly enforced, 13 is biologically far too low. At 13, a child's brain is right in the thick of the wet concrete phase. It is in a wide-open, highly vulnerable state, desperately utilizing its conformist and prestige biases to search for cultural exemplars to lock onto. Allowing a 13-year-old to scroll through endless algorithmic feeds of performative adult content during that critical imprinting phase is a biological mismatch of epic proportions.
During those critical years, their brains are explicitly expecting something else. They should be engaging in the friction and negotiation of free play. They should be practicing the physical attunement and the social electricity of synchrony with their peers in real life. They should be utilizing their prestige bias to look up to local, real-world role models who demonstrate actual competence and character.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive by looking at the bizarre, slow-growth evolutionary path of human childhood. We learned that nature took a massive gamble, giving us a 10-year delay in physical growth, specifically so our big brains could undergo an intensive cultural apprenticeship.
A huge biological gamble.
Right, and we are biologically designed to wire our neural pathways through the low-stakes physical risks of free play. We are meant to learn emotional regulation through the joyful face-to-face synchrony of attunement, and we are meant to map out our social values through the careful observation of prestigious, highly skilled people in our immediate physical communities.
But over the span of just a few short years, a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, that entire million-year-old system was hijacked. We systematically took the play-based childhood, dismantled it, and replaced it wholesale with a phone-based childhood. We have unknowingly deprived a generation of kids of the very environment, the specific physical friction and social stimuli that their brains are biologically demanding in order to grow up healthy.
If you are listening to this right now, this synthesis of biology and technology is the master key to understanding the current cultural moment. Whether you are a parent currently in the trenches trying to raise a teenager, an aunt, an uncle, a teacher looking at a classroom of distracted students, or just a citizen trying to make sense of the world, this framing changes everything.
It really does. It explains the profound anxiety, the rising depression, and the pervasive fragility we are witnessing. This is not just a tired trope of older generations complaining about kids these days. It is not a cyclical moral panic about a new genre of loud music or a scandalous style of clothing. The data and the biology prove that we are looking at a documented fundamental rewiring of the human developmental sequence.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing what happens to children when their foundational imprinting, that highly vulnerable wet concrete phase, is shaped by the vast asynchronous algorithmic virtual world instead of the physical one. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder on your own. It builds on everything we've unpacked today, but it requires looking just a little further down the timeline. Think about this. What happens in 10 or maybe 20 years when this very Generation Z, the very first cohort of humans to imprint their cultural operating system on algorithms, glowing screens, and disembodied emojis, what happens when they become the adults tasked with raising the next generation of human brains? Will the institutional memory of the play-based childhood be completely gone? When you inevitably wake up from your next Rip Van Winkle sleep a decade from now, what kind of physical world will those digitally imprinted children be building for the rest of us?